Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Inside the Psychopathic Mind podcast. Again, host is myself, Jason Smith, along with Carl Giacono. And today we have a special guest, Dr. Tod Roy. He's going to help us talk about Charles Manson. And Dr. Tod Roy is a retired clinical and forensic psychologist. He has worked in both public and private practice throughout his career. His specific forensic areas were competency to stand trial, mental status at the time of the offense, and child protective matters. Welcome, Tod. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, Tod, it's really a pleasure to have you. We were lucky to meet and have you kind of get this Charles Manson Rorschach protocol, which is something Jason and I've been playing with for a long time to want that protocol to compare to Ted Bundy's. But I think what you're going to bring to the picture today and to the data that we have will be very interesting, as you were actually able to interview him. When you review Charles Manson's history, and a lot of people are semi-familiar with it or heard things because there's obviously a lot of books and a lot of media that one can watch to get even a feel for his demeanor and the way he presented himself. But you really look at a guy that if he was born 20 years later, we probably wouldn't even be talking about him. He fit into a time in our society and culture was he was able to fit in as a misfit in groups of marginal people for the most part, and even accepted by people that had some abilities, notoriety perhaps, or accomplishments. Because one of the things when society accepts deviance in any way, people like Manson are able to fit right in where they normally wouldn't. And I can remember years ago having the opportunity to interview Manson myself and turned it down because of the cost flying from San Diego up to the closer to the Bay Area and the waste of time. And I figured he'd just perform and act as he seemed to do in all the news media. And I could go all the way up there and he could decide flippantly to not even see me. So it's a real treat to have you here, Tod, and we're very fortunate. And maybe you could start out with just telling us a little bit about the context surrounding how you were able to interview him and test him.
Okay. Well, he was at Corcoran State Prison in a special unit with a lot of other famous or infamous individuals like Sirhan, for example. What happened was he got caught with contraband, literally. And it could have been money, it could have been drugs, it could have been a cell phone. What that did, though, is they charged him, of course, and because of his background, he was going to be ineligible for a SHU term, which is secure housing unit, and the most maximum secure prison we have here in California was Pelican Bay State Prison. Well, Pelican Bay was under scrutiny for cruel and unusual punishment, especially those that were housed in the secure housing unit, and if they had a mental illness. I came on board to develop an assessment team that would aid in identifying those individuals in the SHU, and I started in June '97, and he came in August. It was just serendipity in some respects that he showed up. So he had to be evaluated to exclude him from the SHU or to let him go to the SHU. And since he had such a very long history of mental illness and diagnoses of schizophrenia and paranoid delusions and the like, he was sent to the newly developed psychiatric services unit, where on B Yard, they converted one whole unit into a treatment center.
So loosely, you're doing a triaging procedure. These aren't the right terms, but it kind of fits the idea to see if he's a danger to himself or to others, or to see if the institutional setting is adequate for managing his behavior.
Well, if he's mentally ill, he gets special treatment.
Yes.
From the standpoint of the administration, they didn't want him there. They initially were going to put him in the clinic, but the at the time, the chief medical officer said, "Oh, we can't go there because there's women." And basically, the charge was get rid of them if we can.
Nice.
Well, put bluntly, they
Yeah,
didn't want to. Administration, medical side of the hierarchy did not want him there.
of course not.
So I saw it as an opportunity to evaluate him.
Sure.
And so I was able to do that.
What were the instruments you used in the evaluation, Tod?
I used the Tony test of nonverbal intelligence. I used the WAIS similarities and, what's the other one? Vocabulary. Similarities, vocabulary, the rat reading test, the Rorschach, the MMPI, and I filled out the psychopathy checklist.
Ah, we want to ask you about that one. But I want to ask Jason at this point, did you hear anything in what Tod said that kind of would be relevant to one or more of the items on the PCLR, the hair psychopathy checklist, Jason?
In terms for Manson, yeah.
In what he said so far, yes.
Well, yeah, breaking rules, irresponsibility while in prison, the conning and kind of manipulation to kind of get special treatment too. It's kind of just what I was kind of hearing so far from just hearing how Manson got to his prison.
Yeah, they're notorious psychopaths, and obviously, Tod, we've talked a lot with the audience before about psychopathy isn't one trait. It has to have a combination of all these traits and behaviors. But certainly one of the things we would look at is the idea of the institutional infractions, because they're higher in psychopaths.
Right. And he had over 100, I'm trying to think, maybe 139 or 140 infractions.
Jeez.
His correctional score was in the mid 350s.
Oh, my Lord.
He had accumulated quite a bit of documentation regarding his behavior while in the prison system, which spanned darn near 40 years, I think, pretty close.
Well, what did you find, before we ask you the next question, what did you find related to the PCLR?
The charisma and the abnormal sexual practices. He claimed he was bisexual at one point. It didn't matter to him. It was just something like going to the toilet, I think, is how he described it in one interview.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Which is one of the things that will differentiate in our next podcast when we talk about Ted Bundy and his sexual sadism. For Manson, the sexual behavior was just a sideline related to the psychopathy.
Well, it was also a control measure too, because when he first when he was first put in the Gabalt School for Boys, he was raped. And then subsequently in other placements, he himself had been charged with rape. And at one point even was found, engaged in homosexual practices at the point of a knife. So it was a power thing. Yes. The other thing that was interesting about him, because he was so vulnerable and such a small character, he developed a pattern of self-defense acting crazy. Mm-hmm. He would wave his arms, he would scream gibberish and things like that to keep larger, stronger boys and later, even, shall we say, people interviewing him, he would do the crazy act in order to, in some ways, control the interview itself, and also to protect him, at least when he was younger. By the time in his 20s, when he was in prison, he had established himself as pretty institutionalized. I don't think he was preyed upon as much in his early years. Even at one point when they were going to parole him out of, I think it was, I want to say, Treasure Island or something like that, he asked not to go in 1967. He said, please, this is my home. don't want to go. Can I stay? And of course they said no, which was probably foolish on their part. But considering, what transpired after his release in 1967.
Yes.
So that certainly makes a lot of sense, Todd. Well, what was your final? Did you come up with an actual score for the PCLR, the hair psychopathy chapter?
36.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. We had as you know, in the article, the three of us wrote together. I had done a lot of training and often used the Charles Manson and Ted Bundy as practice scoring cases because there was so much information and you could bring in tapes of them being interviewed. So you could really capture both aspects of psychopathy, both the character traits, the narcissism, as well as the antisocial behavior, just classically so. And we always came up for Manson somewhere around between 37 and 40, little variation. And usually if there was a 1 on an item, it was because there wasn't enough information or some conflicting information. But he's really a kind of a prototypical psychopath on most of the items. Well, so you go in there to do the testing and interview. Can you describe and tell us a little bit about what that was like?
Well, my evaluation started with the videotape of they're walking him into the prison at 3:00 in the morning. He was brought in by 4 custody officers. The first one was walking backwards, filming him walking onto the yard and all the way into a cell, I'm pretty sure. And he had 2 custody officers on each side. He was chained at the waist and the ankles, and then a follow-up behind. So there were 4 guys that brought him in. The other interesting thing is he came up in a 3-car caravan. Now, I don't know I'm sure you've seen how those guys drive when they're transporting someone. Yes. They go bumper to bumper. They go 75 and 80 miles an hour, and they know they're never going to get stopped.
It sounds like an X-file.
So what was fascinating about him is he talked nonstop. He kept trying to gather information from the custody officers. And it was just interesting to see how he was interacting. He was, my first sense was he knows who he is and he knows how people perceive him. And he plays to that perception in many ways. But his questioning of the officers and where he was pretty normal for the most part. But there seemed to be some pressure to it because I think he was probably anxious in some respects, although he's probably been transferred many times while in the prison system. So this is 3:00 in the morning. I get the call when I come on board at 7 in the morning. So I'm preparing and I go to the unit where we do our interviews, and they bring him out. And he knows my name already. Somehow makes an association somehow because my last name is Roy, that he's somewhat of Scottish also and related to the McClellan, I think, Scotch company people. I don't know. It was kind of weird, but his presentation is very genial when you think about it. He's very engaging, talks to you, answers your questions, denies any wrongdoing in terms of the Tate LaBianca murders and stuff. In general, we carry on a conversation. I tell him what my understanding is of why he's there, and that part of my process with him is to determine whether he'll stay where he is, go to the SHU, or go back to Corcoran. And he agrees. He says, fine, I'll do it. And so we just started basically talking at first, and then we shifted into, the administration process. I calculated that I spent about 27 hours with him, one form or what was fascinating about his test responses was that he was at reading at the third grade level. He had his IQ was just about in the low average range. One was 103, and the other one, the similarities and vocabulary subtests put him around 97, 98. I can't remember. I could look at, I have the report here with me, but I could pull it up and give you specifics. And then, of course, that's the rat, the waste, the Tony. The Tony was a better example. That's a nonverbal test, and there's testing the limits with it as well, and I did both, and that placed him just above 100, like 100, 103 or 102, I think. The MMPI was problematic because he's in a cage. I don't have a recording of the questions, so I have to ask him.
Oh, okay.
And record his answer. And of course, I justify that because of the setting we were in. And I didn't have the recording of the MMPI questions that he would have listened to in other circumstances.
It's also, in some ways, Tod, probably that would be a better way of doing it than sitting him alone in a room and expecting him to pay attention for that many questions, which inherently antisocial folks don't. They're either inconsistent on the end of the MMPI. I remember classically one psychopath came up to me, he completed the MMPI in a group setting in 15 minutes. And he came up and I looked at him like, what the hell's going on here, man? And he says, well, Doc, I completed a speed reading course in the joint. So, I mean, so actually reading to him isn't a bad idea.
Yeah. Which one of the impressions I had of him, he's an auditory learner. He doesn't read very well, very level. Yeah. So he really pays attention to what's going on around him. He's very alert, sensitive to what's going on around him. And of course, if something happens and he can use it, he did. I'm going to tell you a story that was kind of funny. Well, what happened in the course of the evaluation, the chief medical officer was concerned I might somehow be influenced by Charlie. And so they said, well, you can't see him after after the evaluation. So they assigned interestingly enough, they assigned him to one of the psychologists who was a woman.
Oh boy.
Well, she reported that when she first went to see him, he asked her if she was afraid of him. And she responded, afraid of you? You're an old man in a cage. And what was particularly interesting was that she had never heard of him before until I presented his case at our meeting. So
that's interesting.
Yeah.
In itself.
That was, who's that? When we started talking about him.
At any time during your interview and the testing, did anything get confrontational where he let down his guard and you kind of saw the angry part of him?
No, he cooperated throughout because it was in his interest, I think, to do so because he's out of his cell, number one. He's getting to interact and see what's going on in the unit that he's been placed. And of course, he's gaining and gleaning information from the cellies around him when he's on the tier.
Yes. So, could have you, Tod, anticipated any situation that might have caused him to let down his guard and behave differently?
I guess I could have confronted him regarding his denial of the murders in particular. But I chose the non-confrontational approach, which I thought would be more beneficial in terms of gaining information from him.
I mean, what's the purpose of otherwise? But one of the things you hear about psychopaths, and I want to hear your thoughts, and at least some of them I've seen this in, is, in fact, I talked to someone who was a distant relative of Charles Manson, and what she said the family paid attention to with him was his eyes. His eyes looked evil. Mm-hmm. And, at times when you interview psychopaths, you get that kind of predatory stare, that kind of empty, almost like you're looking into the eyes of a shark or a snake.
Mhm.
But it sounds like in this particular interview, nothing came up that
No.
would be near that.
No, I've had that experience interviewing people, but I didn't have
Yes,
that experience working with him.
cool.
Was there any
Okay.
kind of dramatic or, like the shows that he does on, on those interviews? Did he try to, was there any big displays of who I am or anything like that, any grandiosity or anything like that in the interview either?
No, no, that's what's interesting, because when you look at the interviews that he had with Diane Sawyer, you look at the interviews with Tom, what's his name, and a few others, he's controlling the interview by his
Mhm.
behavior. He wants to convey who he thinks he is and be intimidating to the person interviewing him, if at all possible. But there was none of that with him. He seemed to try and want to create some kind of connection. It was be what I would describe it. And of course, he was able to do that with a lot of people, a lot of women in particular, but he wasn't able to do that with me.
So you saw him at a time in his life when you get this kind of, I hate to almost say it, but it's probably true, this kind of lonely and empty, failing psychopath. And he had nothing to prove or really to gain from you other than information and maybe a placement in a thing. So he didn't really come across with that kind of what Jason was getting at, the grandiosity, entertaining, all the
Mhm.
BS, the flamboyant kind of stuff that he's been known for.
Well, he didn't do it with me, but he did it with someone else. Um, Unfortunately, they put him in a group setting.
So he could recreate his family.
I have no idea. It wasn't my decision. But we had a very young recreational therapist, and
Oh no.
she was very attractive.
Oh, of course.
And he did one of his gigs, I guess, for lack of a better term, and she ran from the room saying he's speaking in tongues.
Oh, geez. Well, you know, one of the first things that you said about when you saw him coming in, that he kept talking, or he was always talking to the officers. We'll pay attention when we get to the Rorschach and see if there's any indices that are, you know, consistent with that kind of behavior, as we know there are. Did you want to turn to the Rorschach at this point, Tod?
Say again, please.
Oh, would you like to turn to the Rorschach at this point, or did you have other things to add?
I'm open to whatever we're going to be doing and talking about. So
what do you think, Jason?
Sure, I guess, yeah. What was the experience of giving him the Rorschach, I guess? How did
well,
he take it? How did he interact with it?
um, he's in a cage. There was, well, for lack of a better term, we called them
Yeah.
interview cells, but it's basically a cage,
Hmm.
and had an open port. So I think I was able to either I showed him the card or I handed him the card, but I must have held on to, because there was no turning of the card or anything like that with him. He didn't ask me to turn it. He looked at it and he gave his response pretty quickly for the most part. And it had a bizarre quality to it in many instances. But I think he um, he found it an interesting thing to do. He had been given the Rorschach years and years ago when he first came into the prison, and that person diagnosed him as a schizophrenic. So I'm pretty sure he was, blending and embellishing in distorted kinds of ways the images. He never said that he'd ever done it before, so maybe he forgot. So I thought he was engaged pretty much into the process.
Well, it
There was
sounds like the responses he gave, as the three of us have gone over this in the article we wrote, seemed pretty legitimate, that he wasn't necessarily filtering, and just as you described, his actual behavior during the testing.
Yeah, pretty much. He just was engaged in the whole process. which in a way is somewhat surprising. But but on the other hand, given his psychology, he knew somehow that that was going to, you know, reflect him in some respects and present more information about him. I don't know if he knew what kind of information. You know, he didn't.
And see, and you think about his whole life was one big con and manipulation,
Mhm.
which would be an item on the PCLR as we're describing this, but it didn't sound like a lot of that, if any, went on with you.
No,
So,
I never felt like I was being played, and I know what it feels like when someone's
yes,
playing you. It was just
per-
fascinating.
perhaps, yeah, perhaps he used that time with you in part because of his boredom. He found you interesting, non-threatening, and somehow you were someone to talk to.
Hmm. I would think that's accurate. Yeah.
Huh. Well, when we look at the Rorschach, and we've all looked at this together, some things that stand out for me with this protocol that were real consistent with who he is. I mean, uh, the general kind of failed grandiosity, where he just it didn't seem like really the Rorschach was more consistent with kind of being in a chronic paranoid state, which often happens with psychopaths to the end of their life. They're banal. It's kind of like the protocols of the Nazi war criminals, where they're kind of banal and empty. And this is the same thing Cleckley and other people describe. His inner world seemed to be somewhat empty except for sex and aggression, just primitive impulses, probably
Hmm.
consistent, indicative with his entire life. What really stands out in his Rorschach is the multiple areas that picked up his impaired interpersonal relationships. And how basically they were just used, where he used others to manipulate him, a lot of a devaluation, lack of empathy. Um, in general, when we compare him to other people like Ted Bundy, Manson was a guy that really just didn't fit in anywhere. He doesn't
So
have the
he,
shock response. Yeah, go ahead.
he did fit into the prison population.
Right.
He never adjusted to the norms of society. He
Yes.
viewed all interaction when he was on the streets in Haight-Ashbury and then L.A. as a form of uh, that he had to learn, but he was using it, which is very typical of him because he started
Yes.
very early on. Um, in fact, that's part of the problems I think that developed with him and led to the Tate LaBianca stuff was his expectation. You know, he did record at Dennis Wilson's home.
Mhm.
They did put up one of his songs on one of Dennis Wilson's or the Beach Boys record. It was a B-side. That they changed the title and they never gave him writing credits. And and eventually Dennis Wilson decided he couldn't handle this guy and was quite afraid of him.
Of course.
And you know, he actually moved out of his house on Sunset Boulevard because of Manson and all the people that were showing up. And they were evicted before the lease was up on the house. But in the interim, when asked about it, he said, well, he took over $100,000 worth of my stuff.
Oh,
And the other aspect was he had 2 luxury cars that they destroyed. And who knows what else they did.
Hmm.
But I kind of forgot where I was going with this.
the
Well,
good
just the
examples of describing how he
yeah.
really didn't fit in anywhere
No.
except the
Yeah.
prison setting.
Oh, yeah. Now I remember. Like in prison, of course, as you well know, working with these guys, your word is the only thing you got in terms of your interactions with other inmates. Well, Terry said, we'll get back to you. And Charlie took that at faith that that was the case, not recognizing, of course, in that business, we'll get back to you could mean anything, and it could be a dismissal. So that led to his resentment a little bit towards Terry Melcher, and was one of the reasons why I went to Cielo Drive to extract his revenge on that. But
So did he talk about those? Did you, obviously, I guess you brought it up, but after that, he kind of just, he tried to kind of get through those questions as quick as possible and not really kind of harp on that or anything like that in the interview.
I never directly discussed with him anything that he had been charged with.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is stuff I've gleaned from, the Bugalosi book, Wikipedia, stuff like that.
Gotcha.
Well, Tod, what are your personal reactions and feelings of having done this interview, and now you can sit here and talk about it with us?
Mm-hmm.
You look back on it.
It was a unique opportunity that I took advantage of because I was in a position to do so. And I thought by doing so, I was going to be able to, well, one of the fears of the administration was I was going to publish.
Mm.
And I said, yes, I am. I'm going to write this up and I'm going to submit it to the Journal of Personality Assessment. And that's when they got a little scared about it a little bit. And they said, well, you give us all your materials. And I said, well, I don't think I can do that because they were all mine, because they didn't have any materials in the prison to administer to people. So that was a roadblock. So then I was told I couldn't do anything till he was released from California Department of Corrections or he died. And of course, he died. And I worked with Malloy and put together the article that was in the management journal.
So so you said you did about 27 hours with him. So at the end of the report, what did he go back? Did he go to the SHU? What was how did that go?
Well, with the diagnosis of psychotic disorder, NOS, he was eligible for a SHU exclusion. So we kept him in the PSU, and he was there about maybe 6 months. And then his sentence was up because it was very short compared to some of those guys who were doing life in the SHU, which they can't do anymore. And so the issue came, well, what's his transfer going to be back to Corcoran? And so we're in the team, the custody team, but he had a counselor and the like. And we decided we'd just treat him like anybody else and send him back on the bus, which we did.
Oh, wow. So a lot different when he came versus when he left.
That's correct, yeah.
And you said, so after the evaluation, you had no you weren't allowed to have any interactions after the assessment or anything like that? The 6 months? Okay.
Yeah.
Tod, did you get any sense with your interactions with him, and this is stretching a little bit, you get any sense of what his view of his life, looking back on it, because you saw him in the latter phases, when he was aged? Was there any moment or moments where you kind of, could get a feel or sense for that?
Well, I got a sense that he knew of his notoriety and he knew how people reacted to him, and using his sensitivities, in terms of how other people are, like some psychopaths are really able to recognize in individuals, vulnerabilities. I don't think he got that out of me.
So he never, and when you talk about his notoriety and his manipulation, in the Wikipedia, when you look up the background on Charles Manson, it says little known facts. He said apparently, and you never know if this stuff is factual, that he began to learn how to manipulate because he took a Dale Carnegie course.
I think that's accurate. I think that's accurate because he did that. He was also an aficionado of Scientology when he was at McNeil Island. He developed a whole rap, I guess, when he was in the Haight that included, Dale Carnegie stuff and included Scientology stuff. He kind of created his own religious, spiritual guidance program, but she used to draw people in, which mainly were women more than men. And the women, of course, he used and prostituted to get men into his realm. So, he started as a pimp and a thief, and he ended up as a pimp and a thief when you get right down to it.
Yeah, you never find in any generation, you're always able to find empty, damaged people or people that are that naive that get hooked into people like this because of their charisma, their
Right.
grandiosity. It's classic kind of for psychopaths to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And it looks like from your report and your evaluation, it sounded like, you disagreed sometimes with putting him in groups and stuff like that. Was there any other conflicts that for trying to manage him those 6 months that kind of were difficult, or people trying to see him or things like that? Or
To my recollection, he had no write-ups. He just kind of went day to day, and when it was time to go, he went.
okay.
It's almost like I have to chastise myself for this observation, but it's almost if he was in a controlled setting and couldn't harm anybody, you could almost have some empathy for his emptiness and sadness of such a wasted life.
Mm.
Remember, I wouldn't let him out. I would never forget who he is, but almost if you allowed yourself to go there.
Mm-hmm. Well, I never empathized with him. The one thing that I think I did have empathy for, and I don't understand it, but the multiple abandonments by his mother. And she seemed to have a push-pull relationship with him throughout his life. I mean, she moved to McNeil Island when he was at McNeil Island. She moved to just that community around that prison. He had married another woman at that point in time, and they lived together. But the interesting thing is, and Bugalosi reports this in his book, Helter Skelter, that they brought her to his trial. And I said, would you like to see him? And she said no, which in a way is saying, enough is enough, probably. But the multiple abandonments, I think, contributed significantly to his sense of self. And of course, he can't be that bad. He has to be really good, in terms of grandiosity and self-image. The other thing is that in that primary relationship, he attempted to bond, but she always was, in some respects, rejecting him, placing him into Gibalt. I can't take care of him. There was a reputed rumor that she sold him for a beer in a bar. She would take him to the bars with her brother. Yeah, the mother would with her brother, would go to bars and drink. She would leave him with babysitters, and his other family members would have to go find him and bring him back after a couple of days. So it was just kind of a chronic insult to one's sense of self in some respects. And of course, it started very early. He was 2 years old when she went to prison for 3 years. So started there, and it continued when she got out 3 years later. She kept moving around, kept hooking up with different men. And one of them even said, "You're fine. I'm fine with you, but I can't take the kids." So she put him away.
It's just always so interesting. It raises this question, Tod and Jason, that we look at individual cases and the nature nurture kind of thing that as psychologists, they always ask us about on the licensing exams.
Right.
And they finally came up with the brilliant conclusion in psychology that was a combination of both. But you look at these kind of horrendous backgrounds that we often find in people, then you find people with horrendous backgrounds that don't do these kinds of things.
Yeah.
So it's a puzzle. We haven't solved that in psychology, the answer to that.
Yeah. Well, his father, who he never met, was really kind of itinerant. Probably had some traits like that in some respects. Don't know. We don't know much about him because he disappeared off the scene.
I interviewed a psychopath that was in a special housing unit because he had just assaulted someone, and they brought me in because he was going to be my test subject to demonstrate how to do the PCLR. And he was adopted at birth, and apparently the parents that adopted him, well, they probably weren't perfect, but there's nothing outlandish or that stood out. He raped his adopted mother when he was 14. When he was about 6 years old, he set one of the neighborhood kids on fire. So it seems like almost individual cases when we think about psychopathy is how they get from point A to point B.
Mm-hmm.
Few people seem to be born as psychopaths, but I have seen a couple, very few, that almost that seems to be the case.
Well, isn't there some research about the genetics of this in terms of inheritability from prior, parents in some respects? I've heard it described, and I think it's Rain. I'm not remember correct.
Oh, yeah. Adrian Rain.
Yeah. And he described it as at one point in time as a survival technique in earlier cultures and systems. And to that extent, there seems to be some validity to that. I remember a case I had in Arizona, adopted boy into, a very stable, conventional religious family. And the kid was a nightmare. He was stealing stuff from his parents, and he was selling it. And they just kept thinking, oh, he'll be better, he'll be better. And I had to let him know that maybe not, that they were in a position to, they could lose everything trying to support this kid. And
yes.
He had absolutely no real emotional connection with the family that raised him into teen years.
Yeah, Tod, it seems to come down in the final analysis of treatment if possible and management if not. We look at the etiology, other than the ones that need some biochemical kind of intervention can slow down the behavior or stop the moods from shifting, or if they have an observable psychosis, control the voices and so forth. Often it comes down to not so much debating about the etiology, but really, can this person be managed, or can there be some treatment, strides or things we can make with this individual?
Well, that's proven to be a fallacy, in terms of treatment, in terms of changing behaviors, and which is unfortunate. But there's always I found this, working in a system, there were the ones that kind of believed they could make a difference. And they were kind of blind to the fact that some of the people they were working with were never going to change. And it would just become a management problem. But they believed in the therapy, and they believed in the relationship that could be established, and seemed to be clueless that they could be taken advantage of on that basis. So,
yeah, when people are high in psychopathy, the one thing I found, because part of the trick is that how did you arrive at have a high score on the PCLR? You can have different items that get you to that above 30. And I have found some people that you can help them deal a little bit with anger management and slow down some of their behavior, maybe learn to think a little differently, all of the criminal thinking model. But yeah, you basically don't change them. And some people don't seem like they can benefit at all.
Yeah. Well, Charlie, I think, is one of them.
Yeah. Well, he would be the definition in the dictionary for institutionalized. Go there and look that. Yeah, and like you said, at times he said, "Don't let me out."
Yeah. Well, at that point in time, he was 32, I think, and he had spent half his life in institutions. By that point in time, when he's 32 years old, and then when you consider when he was released for about 2.5 years, and before he was arrested and charged with the murders and stuff.
And then the family and the ranch that he set up, that was just just an extension, I think, or like a halfway house, it feels like.
Yeah.
So
without
just trying to find that
guidance.
Yeah, exactly. That he was giving, and you don't want anyone for him to be in charge, not to be the warden.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Well, Jason, I think I just want to thank Tod for showing up here and helping us
Yeah.
out. This was very interesting. Fun for both of us too, related to the testing data and the case itself.
Yeah, it was. It was a pleasure having you on and hearing the stories. Any lasting things that you want to kind of say that maybe we didn't ask about Manson that you want the audience to know?
I can't think of anything really. It's just a matter of what questions I'm asked and what I can recall and what my opinions would be on the matter. So
Okay. Do you feel like your 27 hours with him was time well spent, I guess? I guess we'll finish on
well,
that.
at the time, that's what it was. The only way it's ever, been fruitful has been through, the articles and even this interview.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah. No, we really appreciate you giving some insights, probably some things that people haven't heard about Manson in terms of interactions. Like you said, we've seen all the news clips and everything like that and how he acted. So a completely different way when, you know, he's not necessarily in control and he has something to gain, I guess, from acting appropriately.
I guess you could say that. At least he learns how to go with the flow while being in prison, because he was
Mhm.
institutionalized very early in his life. And he knew how to get along in some respects. And by the time he's older, when I saw him, I think in his early 60s, um, he he had settled in. He had made his mark in the world, so to speak, in a rather notorious manner. He relished the attention that he received for his uh, behaviors, and he had a reputation and as a different kind of individual. He was a target early on in his prison career. He was set on fire when he was at the California Medical Facility. Um, he
Yes,
got second and third degree burns when a paint thinner was put on him by another inmate in an art room and lit him on fire. So,
we ended up as an antidote. The inmate that did that ended up in the San Luis Obispo County Jail for a period of time when I was there.
really,
So I guess it's really a small world. So that was what he was notorious for, setting Manson on fire.
yeah. So,
Yeah. Well, Carl, any final thoughts or anything else?
No, there's things that feels complete to me, Jason.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
So again, we appreciate it, Tod, for you
yeah,
coming on.
I'm glad to have participated. I hope I, was able to bring some understanding of him in different contexts that he's been seen by other people. And so thank you
Yeah.
for inviting me in on this project.
Yes, of course. So, everybody, this will be the end of our podcast on Charles Manson. Again, please like and subscribe to our podcast, either on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. In the descriptions, we'll have links to the articles that have been written, as well as you can check out maverickpsychology.com if you want any consultation or any help with the Rorschach or PCLR with myself and Carl. So, again, thank you, Tod, and thank you, everybody, for
It's
listening.
been a pleasure.
Thank you.